Howdy doody, my real estate loving peeps. Thanks for tuning into another video and congratulations on investing the time to become a more educated consumer. If you don't know me by now, I'm Ricky Flores of the Margo and Ricky team. In today's video, we are going to be diving into a very important provision in the purchase agreement and what it means to elect into or out of this particular provision. Now, I'm not an attorney, nor am I here to provide you with legal advice. My goal here is to educate you on this provision so when we're writing offers together and you see this in the purchase agreement, you'll understand it better. But first, please be sure and like the video and help me grow this channel by subscribing if you find these videos informative and helpful. We'll laugh and learn together. It'll be great, I promise. All right, let's get into it. Liquidated damages are a contractually agreed upon amount the buyer will owe the seller in the event the buyer breaches contract. In the CAR contract and the PRDS contracts, which are typically used in the Mid-Peninsula region of the Bay Area, that amount is usually 3% of the purchase price, which is also the same amount as the initial deposit. For example, on a purchase of $1 million, if a deposit of $30,000 is placed in escrow and the liquidated damages provision is initialed by both the buyer and the seller, then the buyer breaches the contract, the seller may be entitled to the $30,000 as liquidated damages. It doesn't matter whether the seller has incurred an actual loss that is more or less than the $30,000. The purpose of this provision is to set the amount of damages in advance so that proof of loss is actually not necessary. Actual damages are the actual loss suffered by the non-breaching party, often specified amounts from receipts and invoices. Liquidated damages must be a reasonable estimation at the time of contract, be no more than the actual amount paid, be for a residential 1 to 4 unit property where the buyer intends to occupy, in which case 3% or less is presumed valid, be in a provision separately signed or initialed, be 10-point bold type or, in red, 8-point bold type in that provision. For multiple payments wherein A, the total satisfies 1, 2, and 3, B, each payment satisfies number 4 and 5. Liquidated damages are limited to deposits actually paid. If there's no deposit, there are no liquidated damages, and the damaged party could go after the breaching party for more than 3% of the contractually agreed upon purchase price. Remember, these are legally binding documents and not to be taken lightly. Say a buyer breaches a contract. Well, for a residential property with 1 to 4 units, if the deposit is 3% or less, the seller gets the deposit actually paid. If the deposit is over 3%, the seller gets 3% and must return the overage unless the seller can validate why the 3% presumption of reasonableness is overcome. As a realtor representing a buyer, we should use CAR Form RID, DID form starting in mid-December, when the buyer increases the deposit. This form includes an optional liquidated damages clause. Without this form, increased deposits are not subject to the liquidated damages provision. Now, say you're a seller and you receive an offer to purchase your property, but the buyer or buyers did not initial the liquidated damages provision. When trying to include liquidated damages back into the contract, have all parties go back and initial in the purchase agreement. The seller should return the purchase agreement with the counteroffer so that the buyer knows if it's being initialed. The seller should check the box accepting the purchase agreement subject to the attached counteroffer. This is an example of why you should work with a realtor, and a good one, when buying or selling a home. The details matter, and a good agent, like myself, will make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Who else would spend the time to walk through this with you? Now, if the seller won't release the deposit, we need to use CAR sample letter BDD or demand for deposit for contingency cancellation. If the buyer won't release deposit, we need to use the CAR sample letter SDD or demand for deposit for buyer failure to close. You should use the BDD and SDD sample letters because they both provide deadlines and explain that a $1,000 penalty may be awarded in addition to the deposit. Both letters also meet the small claims court requirement that a demand be made for the amount in dispute before filing a complaint. Generally, a liquidated damages provision doesn't automatically entitle the seller to the buyer's deposit if a transaction doesn't close. It only determines the amount of money a seller can recover from a buyer, and then only if the seller can prove the buyer breached the contract. So let's talk about buyers breaching contracts for a second here. This is a monumental decision filled with emotion, and it can be difficult to separate the emotional side from the rational side of a business transaction, especially in our market. There are a number of factors and variables playing into a buyer's decision. Inventory, interest rates, schools, commute, stocks in the stock market, etc. And a buyer may fail to close a transaction for a variety of acceptable reasons. For example, say there is a financing contingency and the buyer could not reasonably obtain financing. To recover liquidated damages, the seller generally must prove in court or arbitration that the buyer's failure to close the transaction was in fact a breach. Generally, the law does not permit contracts to impose penalties or forfeitures, including a non-refundable deposit, for breach, absent gross negligence or willful or a fraudulent breach. In general, judges are reluctant to enforce penalty or forfeiture provisions when they are inconsistent with the actual damages incurred. The Residential Purchase Agreement, California's language, does not permit such clauses. Any added clause specifying a remedy for a buyer breach, such as a non-refundable deposit or a forfeiture of the deposit, will be invalid if the added clause does not independently comply with the Civil Code's liquidated damages rules. If a buyer makes more than one deposit pursuant to a purchase contract, a liquidated damages clause won't necessarily entitle the seller to the buyer's combined deposits if the buyer defaults. If the real property being sold is a dwelling containing not more than 4 residential units and the buyer intends to occupy one as a residence at the time the purchase contract is made, then each payment that is to be part of the liquidated damages to the seller must be separately initialed or signed in a properly formatted liquidated damages clause. In addition, if the total of all such deposits exceeds 3% of the purchase price, the seller could be limited to 3% even if more is deposited. The CAR form RID, or DID, starting in mid-December, should be signed at the time an additional deposit is made during escrow to make any additional payments part of the liquidated damages. Now, an important piece here for all buyers out there. If you are ratified in a property and you've either offered non-contingent or are past the contingency period and have since removed contingencies you had in the contract, you should be prepared to close the transaction. If for any reason you decide to cancel the contract and back out of the transaction after contingencies have been removed, your first step should be to call a qualified real estate attorney. Once the contract is canceled, the agency relationship between the buyer and the realtor has ended for that transaction, and then it becomes a legal matter and the buyer should seek appropriate legal representation. You guys still with me? That was a ton of information I just threw at you, but it's important nonetheless. If you have any further questions about liquidated damages, please don't hesitate to contact me. As always, my contact info is right here. I'm just a call, text, or click away. Until next time, folks, one love.